Today, we're going to look at 5 terrifying mysteries that have baffled experts and investigators for years. These aren't your typical unsolved cases. These are the kind that will make you question everything you thought you knew about our reality. From a hotel room covered in unexplainable blood to a bypass where people vanish without a trace, sometimes, folks, truth is far scarier than fiction. You won't want to miss this one. On the night of May 19th, 2007, a 23-year-old Navy sailor named Marcus Chen walked into the lobby of the Alaskan Hotel in downtown Juneau. The hotel was this beautiful 3-story building that had been around since 1913, and it was actually the oldest operating hotel in all of Juneau. When Marcus got to the front desk, he specifically asked for what he called the haunted room. The front desk clerk kind of looked at him funny, but Marcus was very serious. He had heard all these stories about this hotel being haunted, and he wanted to experience it for himself. The clerk ended up giving Marcus room 315, and as he walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor, he passed by all these old black and white photographs showing what the hotel looked like back in the gold rush days. The wooden steps creaked under his feet as he made his way up. And around 11:45 that night, guests on the 3rd floor began calling down to the front desk saying they were hearing all this commotion coming from room 315. And so the night manager went upstairs to check it out, but when he got to Marcus's door, it was locked and Marcus wouldn't answer. The manager was about to use his key to open the door when suddenly there was this huge crash of breaking glass. And by the time the manager got inside room 315, the window was completely shattered and Marcus was gone. He had jumped out the 3rd story window. When police arrived a few minutes later, Officer Chris Gifford walked into room 315 and he couldn't believe what he was seeing. The walls were covered in blood. There were handprints everywhere, like Marcus had been desperately trying to get away from something. But the strangest thing was, when they found Marcus on the ground outside, while he was injured from the fall, he didn't have nearly enough cuts or wounds to explain all the blood in the room. The next morning, the hotel owner at the time, Betty Adams, was dealing with Navy investigators who showed up to look into what happened. But instead of focusing on Marcus's injuries or the broken window, they kept asking really specific questions about the history of room 315. They wanted to know about any other incidents in that room. And then Marcus's mother called the hotel from Arizona, and she was hysterical, saying that her son had called her right before the incident. He had told her there was something in the room with him, something that would not let him leave. Now, when they checked the phone records later, there was no record of any call being made from that room. The morning after Marcus jumped out that window, Jill Whites, who was working at the hotel through AmeriCorps, showed up for her morning shift, and she had no idea what had happened the night before. But as soon as she walked in, she saw all these officers in the lobby and the hotel manager, Scott Fry, who was talking to them, and his face was just totally white. And when Jill went up to the 3rd floor to start her usual cleaning rounds, she saw that room 315 was blocked off with police tape. And even though she couldn't go inside, she could see through the doorway that the walls were just covered in this dark red blood. But there was something else. The blood was arranged. It wasn't like random splatter. It almost looked like someone had been writing. Now, Scott, who had been managing the hotel for about 12 years at this point, had actually pulled Jill aside later that day and told her this. He said that over the past decade, multiple guests in room 315 had reported waking up in the middle of the night feeling like someone was sitting on their chest, holding them down. Although nothing violent had ever happened before. A couple days after this, the housekeeping staff was finally allowed to enter and clean room 315. The head housekeeper, Maria, had been working there for over 15 years, and she'd seen some strange things, but she even claimed this was different. As they were cleaning the room, all their supplies kept disappearing and then reappearing in different places. At one point, Maria set down her cleaning bucket, turned around for just a second, and when she looked back, the bucket was empty. All the supplies were lined up perfectly straight on the other side of the room. And the really strange thing was, after they finished cleaning and replaced the broken window, the hotel started getting all these calls from people specifically requesting that same room, 315. Word had gotten out about what happened with Marcus, and now people wanted to experience whatever he had experienced. But the hotel's staff noticed something had changed after this whole incident. The strange activity that used to be mostly confined to 315 started spreading to other parts of the hotel. Housekeepers would find items moved around in rooms that had been empty and locked. Guests would report hearing footsteps in the hallway at night, but when they looked out, no one was there. And so about a week after the Marcus incident, Betty Adams was sitting in her office just trying to figure out what to do about all of this. And she had owned the Alaskan Hotel since 1974, and she'd always kind of kept quiet about any strange things that had happened there. I mean, she didn't want to scare business away. But now, with the story and all the local papers, she was getting calls every day from reporters wanting to know about other haunted rooms, like room 218. In fact, back in 1985, there was this businessman who had checked into room 218 for just one night. And he was a very skeptical man who didn't believe in anything supernatural. Around 2 in the morning, he came running down to the front desk in his pajamas. Pajamas? Or is it pajamas? Totally white as a sheet. And he told Betty that he had woken up to find a woman in an old-fashioned dress sitting at the edge of his bed, just staring at him. And so when he turned on his light, she was gone, but the impression of someone sitting on the bed was still there. And then there's, of course, room 219. And the housekeepers absolutely refused to clean that room alone. Maria, the head housekeeper, had told Betty about in 1996 when she was making the bed in 219, she had just finished putting on fresh sheets when suddenly all 4 corners of the fitted sheet just popped off the mattress at the exact same time, like someone had lifted up all 4 corners at once. Maria claimed there's no way that could happen naturally, but what really bothered her was the bar area. This hotel had this beautiful old bar with all these antique mirrors behind it. And lately, customers and bartenders had been seeing things in those mirrors. They'd see people walking behind them in the reflection, and when they turned around, of course, nobody was there. And sometimes, glasses would just slide right off the bar by themselves, like someone had pushed them. In fact, one night in early June, about 3 weeks after the Marcus incident had taken place, Betty was closing up the bar by herself, and she was counting the till when she heard this sound coming from upstairs. It was like someone walking in high heels on the wooden floors. Well, the problem is she knew all the guests were checked in for the night, so she went up to investigate. And as she walked up the stairs that night, she really began thinking about something she hadn't in a long time. Because back in 1916, there was this young woman who at the time had come to stay at the hotel while her husband was out mining. And the husband had told her he'd only be gone about 3 weeks. But 3 turned into 4 and then 5, and pretty soon, this woman had run out of money to pay for her room. And during this time, the hotel wasn't just a hotel. The 3rd floor had actually been a bordello during the gold rush days. And so this woman, desperate to keep her room, she eventually started working upstairs. And she figured she'd do it just long enough to pay her bills until her husband came back. But then one day, her husband did come back. He had struck gold and rushed back to surprise her, but when he found out what his wife had been doing, he lost it. Now, no one knows exactly what happened after that, but the woman was never seen again. And even though Betty dismissed this story as local folklore, she truly began to wonder in this moment if she was encountering the spirit of that dead woman. The sound of the high heels were just too uncanny. And most disturbingly, it was coming from room 218, which was the exact room where that businessman had seen the woman in the old-fashioned dress. So Betty gets to room 218 and she knows it's empty because no one had checked in there that night. But she can clearly hear movement inside. And so she puts her key in the lock, turns it, opens the door, and the room is pitch black except for the strange red glow coming from the old mirror mounted on the wall. And when Betty opened the door and saw that red glow, she screamed because reflected in that mirror, she could see the entire room was filled with people in old-fashioned clothing, like something straight out of the early 1900s. And so she quickly turned around to look in the room, but it was empty. Now, after that night, Betty would in fact go down to the Juneau Historical Society and kind of going through all these old newspapers from the early 1900s. In the Juneau Empire newspaper from October 1916, there was this tiny article, and it talked about how a miner had come back to town and discovered his wife working in the Alaskan hotel. Now, according to this, there had been some kind of disturbance, but when police arrived, they couldn't find either the miner or his wife. Now, the article mentioned that other guests had reported hearing screaming coming from room 218, but nothing was ever found. The case was just left unsolved. Now, interestingly, after learning this, when she went back to the hotel, she started talking to all of her employees about this strange story she just read. And even the housekeepers talked about how they'd sometimes find room 218's bed completely made up with these really old-fashioned sheets that the hotel didn't even own. And the maintenance guy would mention how the mirror in room 218 would somehow end up crooked every morning, no matter how many times it was straightened. However, one of the most interesting and probably strangest connections was from the Navy investigators. Now, at this point, Betty hadn't received their report yet, but after, it mentioned that right before Marcus jumped out the window, he had been screaming about a woman in an old dress who was trying to push him out. The same type of woman that had been seen in room 218 all those years ago. Now today, this hotel is still open for business and Betty still owns it, but she's stopped trying to hide its haunted history. She just figures people are going to find out anyway. The hotel's even been featured on TV shows like The Alaska Triangle and Portals to Hell. But Betty says that the TV shows never get the whole story right. They always focus on the big scares and the dramatic moments. They never talk about the quiet things, like how sometimes in the middle of the night, you can hear a woman just sobbing in the hallway, or how the bartenders sometimes find old-fashioned coins from like 1910 sitting on the bar in the morning. And room 218? Well, it's still the most requested room in the hotel. But Betty has a pretty strict policy about allowing anyone in there, and not because of the fear of ghosts, but for the fear of what guests might do to themselves when they realize they're not alone. On the morning of June 11th, 2024, a 34-year-old landscaper named Lucas McClish was standing in his kitchen in Boulder Creek, California, packing up his backpack for what he thought was going to be just a quick 3-hour hike in Big Basin Redwoods State Park. Lucas had lived for being outdoors. I mean, he was a very experienced backpacker, and his actual job was working as a landscaper in the forest that had been damaged by fires, so he knew exactly what he was doing out there. And that morning, he was actually feeling pretty excited because he had this new trail route that he had planned. And so as he's getting ready, he's just throwing a few basic things in his bag, just his pants, hiking shoes, a hat, a flashlight, and this little Leatherman tool. And his mom, who he lived with, she kind of pokes her head in the kitchen and reminds him about their big Father's Day dinner coming up that weekend. And, Lucas just kind of laughs and tells her not to worry, that this is just going to be a quick morning hike. Now, normally when Lucas would go hiking, he'd pack way more gear, but this time he's just thinking, you know what, I know these trails like the back of my hand. I've been hiking here since I was a kid. I work here. What could possibly go wrong on a 3-hour hike, right? What Lucas didn't realize was that forest was not the same. Back in 2020, this massive fire called the CZU Lightning Complex had just torn through Big Basin. I mean, we're talking like 97% of the entire park had burned. And so 4 years later, about 24% of that forest was actually alive and growing back. So he drives out to the park, he parks his car, and starts heading down this trail he's hiked probably 100 times before. But about after an hour of walking, something starts feeling off. The trail markers that he usually uses to navigate, they're gone. And all these familiar trees that he's used to use as landmarks, they're either burned down or they just look different now. And soon, Lucas is looking around and he's realizing he can't really tell where he is anymore. All the canyons and ridges that used to be so distinct, they all kind of look the same. It's just this sea of black tree trunks and new undergrowth. And now Lucas can feel a knot forming in his stomach because he's realizing that maybe he's actually lost. And as the afternoon began turning into dusk, he was still trying to convince himself that he wasn't lost. He kept telling himself, this is my familiar territory. I know what I'm doing. morning, but as it got closer to nighttime and the temperature was dropping, Lucas knew he didn't have a whole lot of time. He had to figure things out pretty quickly. So he decided his best move would be to try and make a fire. And so he gathers up whatever dry brush he can, but there's a problem. Everything around him is just soaking wet from all this new growth that's come up since the fire, and no matter what he tries, he just can't get anything to light. And so now he's just sitting there in the dark, and he's getting really cold. His clothes are getting damp from all this wet brush he's been handling, and he's looking around at all these burned out trees, and they're making these weird shadows in the moonlight. Now suddenly, this place that he thought he knew so well feels totally alien to him, and at some point during that first night, he heard movement off in the distance in the darkness. Hoping for the best, he thought it might be a deer, but as he could hear it getting closer, he realized he could potentially be in danger. And so he shined his flashlight in that direction, and he saw these two eyes reflecting back at him. And right away, he knew this was a mountain lion. Now, even though he had dealt with mountain lions before, he knew they weren't usually aggressive towards humans, but he also knew that if they started following you, well, that's generally not a good sign. And this one, it just kept staying at the edge of his flashlight, just watching him. And by the time morning came, Lucas was exhausted and cold and thirsty. He hadn't packed any water because, remember, this was supposed to be just a quick hike. But he could hear this creek somewhere down in the canyon. And so he starts making his way down there, and the whole time he's walking, he just keeps looking over his shoulder, expecting to see this mountain lion following him. Now, when he finally made it down to the creek, he realized he had another big problem. He didn't have anything to drink the water with. And so, thinking quickly, he takes off his hiking boot and he starts using it like a cup to scoop up water. You could imagine how silly he probably felt drinking out of the creek with his boot, thinking that if people saw him, he'd lost his mind. But, when you're in that situation, you gotta do what you gotta do. And so after this, all the days kind of just blended together. Lucas would just wake up covered in wet leaves that he had used as a makeshift blanket, and his whole body would be aching from the lack of sleep and trying to sleep on the hard ground. And every morning he'd have this moment where he just kept telling himself, today's the day I figure this out. Today's the day I get out of here. But the thing about being lost is that your mind starts playing tricks on you. And several times Lucas would swear he could see something in the distance that looked familiar, and he'd get all excited thinking he knew where he was, but then he'd get closer and realize it was just another burned out tree trunk that looked like every other tree trunk around him. And even the mountain lion never left. It just kept pacing and following and stalking Lucas, because he would catch glimpses of it throughout the day. And even at nighttime, he could hear it moving and pacing around, but never trying to attack him. Now, during the course of this experience, he started having these conversations with this mountain lion in his head, like maybe if he could somehow reason with it, it would just leave him alone. Back at home, Lucas's mother was starting to get really worried. She had this big Father's Day dinner all planned out. She'd made his favorite lasagna, bought this special wine, the whole shebang, the family coming over. But when Sunday night came around and Lucas didn't show up, she realized something was horribly wrong, because this was not like him at all. And so she called the police that night, and when she told them her son was missing in the Big Basin, they immediately knew how serious this was. Ever since the fire in 2020, they'd been getting more and more calls about people getting lost. The whole landscape had just changed so much, and pretty soon there were like 300 people out looking for Lucas. They even had the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office, Cal Fire, the Boulder Creek Fire Department, state parks, everybody was out there searching. But the problem is the park is so huge, 18,000 acres, and most of it looks exactly the same now. Just these black trees and new undergrowth everywhere you look. Meanwhile, Lucas was really starting to realize the situation he was in. Fortunately though, he'd been drinking about a gallon of water a day from that creek, using his boot as a cup and eating whatever berries he could find that he knew were safe. But he could feel himself getting exponentially weaker. His clothes were constantly wet, and he was starting to get these weird shivers that wouldn't go away. And by day 8, he was in real trouble. He'd fallen on this rock face and banged himself up pretty bad. And now he was starting to get these symptoms of hypothermia. His thoughts were getting fuzzy, and he kept having these moments where he couldn't remember if he was actually lost or if this was all just some strange dream. And by this point, Lucas had started thinking maybe it wasn't even real anymore. The mountain lion. Maybe his mind was just making it up, because How could this same animal have been following him and stalking him for over a week? But then he'd hear it or catch a glimpse of it through the trees and he'd know it was still there. It was almost like he was having delusions. And at some point, he began actively calling out for help, and he'd just start yelling until his voice was completely gone. Back in Boulder Creek, Lucas's mother was just beside herself. She hadn't slept in days. She kept going into his room and looking at all his hiking gear, trying to figure out what he might have taken with him. And she just kept thinking about that morning and how he just laughed when she reminded him about Father's Day. But finally, on June 21st, day 10, one of the search teams heard something. It was about 3 in the afternoon, and they picked up what sounded like someone calling for help. But the sound was so weak, they couldn't tell where it was coming from. They actually had to deploy these drones with special audio equipment just to try and pinpoint where the voice was coming from. Now, at about 7:30 that night, 2 park rangers found him. Lucas was just sitting there on the ground, his clothes all torn up, covered in mud, still holding on to that flashlight he'd brought with him. And the first thing he said to them when they found him wasn't about being rescued or about how happy he was. He actually asked, "Did you see it? Did you see the mountain lion?" But when they got Lucas to the hospital and checked him out, besides being dehydrated and having lost some weight, he was fine. Just some minor injuries, a lost voice, nothing major. The doctors couldn't believe it, of course. This guy had spent 10 days lost in one of the most challenging environments imaginable, being stalked by a mountain lion, and he'd managed to keep himself alive. Now, for me, the biggest mystery to this entire story is the fact that this place that he thought he knew so well had become something completely different. That fire had changed everything. The landmarks, the trails, even the way sound moved. It was all changed. Now, a few weeks go by, and he was sitting in his kitchen, which was the same place where he'd packed his bag for that 3-hour hike, and he had tried to explain to his mom what it had been like out there. And after talking to his mom for a little while, he began to tell her about the mountain lion. And he said that by the end, he actually felt like that mountain lion was the only thing keeping him sane, because everything else in that forest had changed so much, but at least the mountain lion was real and it was constant. He could see it, he could hear it. It became like this weird companion in a way. In a strange turn of events, search teams would later tell Lucas that he'd actually walked in a huge circle. Even though he thought he was heading towards the ocean, following the sun, he'd basically just been going around and around this one area of the park. As it turns out, he was less than 2 miles from a major trail the whole time. To this day, he still goes out hiking like normal, but obviously he packs a lot more efficiently. However, whether the mountain lion was truly stalking him or not, or whether it really was just a figment of his imagination due to dehydration and hallucinations, that will remain a mystery. On the night of September 8th, 1987, a 24-year-old security guard named David Goldthrope pulled his Land Rover into the parking lot of a construction site near Stocksbridge, England. David was this big guy, a rugby player and a weightlifter, and he wasn't the type to get spooked. In fact, when he'd taken this security job watching over the new bypass where they were building, he thought it would be the easiest money he'd ever made. David had actually been working in this security detail for about 3 months now, and every night was pretty much the same. He'd show up, meet his partner Stephen Brooks. They'd do their rounds, checking the equipment, making sure no one was trying to steal anything from the construction site, and then they'd basically just sit in their Land Rover and talk until sunrise. David met up with Stephen in the security office, a little portable building they had set up near the entrance to the construction site, and the two of them were going over some paperwork from the previous shift when their manager stopped by, and he told them that apparently some kids had been spotted near the site earlier that day, and so they should keep an extra eye out tonight to make sure that nobody was messing around with the equipment. Around midnight, David and Stephen were doing their normal patrol in their Land Rover. They were driving along this partially built section of the bypass right near P. Royd Hill, and they were thinking about a rugby match David had played in that weekend. Stephen was giving David a hard time about missing an easy tackle when suddenly David just stopped talking mid-sentence, because about 50 yards ahead of them, right in the middle of this restricted construction area were children, and they were standing in a circle and they appeared to be playing some sort of game. Immediately, David hit the brakes and Stephen leaned forward in his seat. They both sat there watching these kids who were wearing what looked like really old-fashioned clothing. And then they heard it. These children were singing Ring Around the Roses. Now, David and Stephen both grew up knowing this was just a nursery rhyme, but sitting there at night, watching this happen in the middle of nowhere, it felt totally ominous. And Stephen told David they needed to go check on these kids and figure out how they got onto the site. And so they put the Land Rover in drive and they slowly approached where these children were standing. But when they got within about 20 feet of them, they just vanished. And keep in mind, the entire time they were calling out, nothing. They didn't respond at all. They didn't run away or hide. They just vanished. And so both men decide to grab their flashlights, and now they're investigating the area in the mud where these kids have been standing. And when they look, the only footprints they could find were their own that they had just made getting out of the vehicle. And so Stephen started walking in wider and wider circles, sweeping his flashlight back and forth, just trying to figure out where these kids could have gone. But David just stood there, staring at that spot where the children had been, and kept thinking about how when they got close enough, he could have sworn he saw right through them, like they weren't solid. Now, the two men spent almost an hour searching. They checked every possible hiding spot, every ditch, every piece of equipment, every nook and cranny, but they found nothing. No children, no footprints, and no sign that anyone had been there at all. And so as they're about to head back to their vehicle, and Stephen grabbed David's arm and then pointed up at the half-built bridge above them, and standing on the edge of the bridge was what appeared to be a monk in a black hooded robe. Now, David immediately aimed his flashlight at this mysterious figure, but the beam kind of just went right through it, and they could see the other side of the bridge. And for a few seconds, neither of them moved. They just kind of stood there with their flashlights pointed at this mysterious, transparent figure. And then the monk turned its head and looked directly at them. Now, David would later say that under that hood, where a face should have been, there was just black, nothing. And that's when both of them lost it. They sprinted back to the Land Rover, jumped inside, and David floored it out of there. They didn't stop until they reached the main road, where David pulled over because he was shaking so badly he couldn't drive anymore. And for the next few hours, they just sat there on the side of the road, neither one of them saying a word. Now remember, these were kind of rougher, tougher, bigger dudes, so to be frightened this badly definitely speaks volumes about the authenticity about what they saw. Well, at 4:30 in the morning, their manager found them still sitting in that spot, and he said later that when he walked up to that vehicle, they were both white as sheets, trembling, and Stephen was actually crying. Now, their manager had known these guys for months and realized something happened to these guys because this is very out of character. And in his words, these were just very down-to-earth South Yorkshire lads. Now, the following morning, both men showed up at the local police station. They weren't really sure why they were there because more than likely no one was going to believe them, but they had to tell someone in authority what had happened. When they tried explaining what they'd seen, the officer just kind of looked at them like they were crazy and suggested maybe they should go talk to someone else. Well, they actually went to the nearest church and spoke to the vicar, but after listening to their story for about 20 minutes, the vicar, who was basically more like a senior priest in that church, ended up calling the police to have them removed because they just wouldn't stop talking about it. Now, that was really the last day that either men ever worked on that bypass, and unfortunately, they both quit right then and there, and within a month, they both left the security industry completely. However, word about what both men had seen that night spread pretty quickly through Stocksbridge, and soon, even the local police decided that this is getting serious and they needed to investigate, if for no other reason than to prove there was nothing supernatural going on at the bypass. Well, later on that month, PC Dick Ellis and Special Constable John Beat were assigned to do a nighttime patrol. These guys were very experienced men who had pretty much seen everything there was to see in South Yorkshire. The two of them parked right at P. Royd Bridge, which is the exact spot where David and Stephen had seen this monk figure. Interestingly, PC Ellis would later say that the moment they pulled up, the temperature inside their car dropped so dramatically that they could see their breath. Immediately, just like that, both officers saw it. Standing right next to their car was a figure in a hooded black robe. PC Ellis immediately reached for his door handle, but before he could open it, the figure vanished. They get out to investigate, but the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. And so they were about to get back in their car when suddenly they heard this loud banging sound like someone was hitting the outside of their car with something heavy. And at this point, both men are now terrified because the entire car is shaking. But when they shined their flashlights around, there was nobody there. And when they checked the car afterward, there wasn't even a single mark on it or a dent. And so, wanting to get out of there, PC Ellis tried to start the car, but of course, it wouldn't turn over. And for almost an entire 10 minutes, they sat there trying to get it started while this banging sound just kept happening all around them. And as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet and the car started right up. Following day, when word got out that these two officers had experienced something beyond the grave at the bypass, reporters started showing up at the police station, and you can imagine how crazy that got. But South Yorkshire police wouldn't comment. In fact, to this day, they've never officially acknowledged what happened that night. But that wasn't the end of it. After the bypass officially opened, people kept having weird experiences. There were two runners out early one morning and they saw what looked like a man walking below road level, like he was walking on the old ground underneath the bypass. Now these runners, when they got closer, they were hit with this really strong smell like dust and rot, kind of like being in an antique shop. And then there was another couple driving home late one night who saw what they described as a faceless man hovering above the road. They said the figure actually disappeared into their car, and suddenly the inside of their vehicle filled with this ice cold air. There's a local psychic named Lucinda June who went out to this spot to investigate and described that the moment she drove onto the bypass, her car became frigid and could smell what kind of was like old musty books. And she could even sense that there was a really dark presence there and that it was the spirit of a monk who had died there over 500 years ago. Now, in my opinion, probably one of the creepiest parts about all of this was when local historians really began digging into the area's past. It turns out that 500 years before the bypass was ever built, there had actually been this monastery nearby. And during the time of the Black Death, the monks there had been responsible for burying all these children who had died from the plague. And that nursery rhyme, the security guards had heard those children singing, Ring Around the Roses. Well, a lot of people believe that song actually originated during the plague years. The Ring of Roses was supposed to be about the red circular rash that plague victims would get, and, All Fall Down part was about them dying. Now, in 1994, a TV show called Strange But True decided to do an episode about what was happening on the bypass. Michael Aspel, who's the host, managed to track down PC Ellis and get him to talk about what he'd seen that night. And watching this tough, experienced officer trying to explain what happened to him and John Bead, you could see his hand shaking just talking about it. During filming, the crew interviewed some of the construction workers who had helped build the bypass. Interestingly, a lot of them just kept talking about how none of them would work alone out there, especially after dark. There was one worker in particular, though, who told the crew about how he had been operating an excavator late one afternoon when suddenly his cap got so cold he could see his breath, even though it was like in the middle of summer. Something else I found very fascinating is that a local historian who had access to all these old church records had found something nobody else noticed. Back when the monastery was active, there had been this one particular monk who was known for protecting children. And according to the records, he would walk for miles every night, checking on all the local families, making sure their children were safe. And then during the plague years, when all these children started dying, this monk apparently just lost his mind with grief. Records allegedly show that he would spend his nights walking in circles around the monastery, singing to himself. And one day, they just found him dead on this hill, the exact same hill where they eventually built P. Royd Bridge. Now, unfortunately, the TV crew attempted to interview David and Stephen, but, just didn't work out. They simply refused to appear on camera. Now, the producers of the show were very persistent about getting an interview with these men. And interestingly, David, the one who was interviewed, claimed that what they saw that night wasn't just a ghost, that it was something so terrifying and impactful, it completely changed how both men saw the world. Now today, that bypass is still there, and people still report strange things happening, especially at night. And it is also known as one of the most haunted roads in all of England. The South Yorkshire police still won't officially comment on what happened to PC Ellis and John Beat, and perhaps whatever's out there on that bypass, it's still watching and protecting those children after all these years. But folks, the story is far from over. Fast forward to 2012, and a reporter from the Sheffield Star newspaper managed to track down Stephen Brooks. He was living in a small town about 15 miles away from Stocksbridge. He never moved back to the area. Apparently, he was working as a carpenter, and at first, he didn't want to talk about what had happened, but after a while, he agreed to share one detail he had never talked about before. And Stephen said that in the weeks after that night on the bypass, he began having these really strange dreams. In these dreams, he would be back on that construction site, but instead of being a security guard, he was dressed like one of the monks. And in every dream, he would be kind of walking through this massive field full of small crosses stuck in the ground. And he could hear children singing somewhere in the distance. And every time he tried to find them, he would just wake up in a cold sweat. And these dreams got so bad that he couldn't sleep anymore. And so he started taking sleeping pills, and even that didn't help. And he would just lay in bed at night, absolutely terrified to close his eyes. And every time he did, he just kept hearing that nursery rhyme playing over and over. Interestingly, he also shared how just a few days after his initial experience, he had been home alone trying to write up his resignation letter for the security company when suddenly his entire house filled with this musty, rotting odor, and he heard what sounded like children laughing somewhere in his house. At that point, he searched every room but couldn't find where the sound was coming from, and then when he went into his bathroom to splash some water on his face, he looked in the mirror and saw something moving out of the corner. Standing behind him was the reflection of a hooded figure, the same one they'd seen on the bridge. Although this time, he could see its face, and he just began to physically shut down out of raw emotion and fear, and he wouldn't continue the interview further. He just flat out refused to describe what the face looked like. Basically said that after that moment, he understood why some people literally go insane from fear. Well, the reporter tried to do a follow-up interview and just kept pressing him for it. A few weeks later, found out that he'd suddenly quit his job and moved away without telling anyone where he was going. Apparently, Stephen had been acting really strange in the days before he left. Now, fast forward again in 2019, when they needed to do some repair work on the guardrails on P. Roy Bridge, the crew would only work during daylight hours. Their foreman would tell local officials that his men had been hearing children's voices coming from the empty fields around the bridge, in addition to having these strange feelings of being watched from time to time. But the most recent incident happened last year in 2023. A woman was driving home late one night when her car broke down right on the bypass. And while she was waiting for a tow truck, she said she kept hearing what sounded like footsteps walking around her car. Suddenly, all the electronics went crazy. The radio started switching stations, the lights were flashing on and off, and when the tow truck finally arrived, he found her sitting in her car completely terrified with all the windows covered in what looked like frost, even though, again, it was in the middle of summer. Now, there is speculation that the bypass was actually built right through an ancient burial ground. Others think the monk's spirit is still trying to protect those kids after all these years, but the truth is nobody really knows what's out there on that road. And, like the title of this episode, it remains a terrifying mystery. On the morning of October 16th, 1972, House Majority Leader Hale Boggs walked into a small airport in Anchorage, Alaska, carrying his briefcase and adjusting his tie against the cold. He was there with Representative Nick Begich and Begich's aide, Russell Brown, for what was supposed to be a normal campaign flight to Juneau. Don Johns, their pilot, was already there doing his pre-flight checks on his Cessna 310, and he's going through his checklist. Everything seemed normal. The weather report showed some clouds, but nothing too concerning. There was nothing, absolutely nothing, that would make anybody think twice about taking off that day. And the airport staff even kindly waved to the four men who boarded the plane and saw that Hale and Nick were actually laughing about something as they climbed aboard. Russell was carrying this stack of campaign materials they were going to use at their next stop. And Don, he was just doing what he always did, being thorough, professional, following every protocol. And at 9:13 a.m., Don radioed the tower for permission to take off. He got clearance, and the plane began taxiing down the runway. The tower operator watched as the Cessna lifted smoothly into the air and banked toward the southeast, heading for Juneau. The last thing he remembered seeing was the sun glinting off the plane's wings as it vanished into the clouds. Now, the flight was only supposed to take about 3 hours. Don had radioed in their position a couple times during the first hour, just totally routine stuff. But an hour later, at about 10:18, he made one final transmission, reporting they were flying at 7,000 feet near Johnstone Point. Everything sounded normal, and the 4 men were basically halfway to their destination. And then, nothing. That was the last anyone would ever hear from them. When the plane didn't arrive in Juneau at its scheduled time, nobody really panicked at first because in Alaska, especially back then, flight delays were common. Sometimes pilots would have to change course because of weather, or they'd have to land somewhere else to wait out a storm. And so for a couple of hours, everyone just figured they'd show up eventually. But hours and hours rolled around, and by evening, there was still no sign of the plane and no radio contact. And so people began to get worried. This was a pretty big deal. We're talking about the House Majority Leader of the United States and a sitting congressman who had vanished. Immediately, the Coast Guard launched what would become one of the largest search ops in American history, and within 24 hours, they had over 40 aircraft up in the air searching and scanning an area of roughly the size of West Virginia. Military actually sent in an SR-71 Blackbird spy plane to take these incredibly detailed photographs, which they had never used one of these planes for a search op before. But what made this really strange, though, was that the weather was perfect for searching. And usually when planes go down, especially in Alaska, bad weather is what makes it hard to find them. But during this, they had clear skies, visibility was great. These were ideal conditions. And they knew the exact route and where they should be looking because they had Don's last radio transmission giving them his location. But day after day after day, they just turned up with nothing. There was no wreckage, there was no oil slick, there was no emergency beacon signal, there wasn't even a piece of debris. This plane had literally, with 4 people on board, mind you, just completely vanished. And as this was going on, search teams began noticing some really weird things, like their compasses would suddenly start spinning for no reason, or that their radios would pick up these really odd static noises that nobody could decipher or explain. And multiple pilots reported this really unsettling feeling of disorientation, like they couldn't trust their own instruments anymore. In fact, one search pilot, a guy named Jack Anderson, had been flying in Alaska for over 20 years, and he told his supervisor something about the search felt wrong. And he said when they'd fly over certain areas, they'd get these intense feelings of dread, like something was telling them to stay away. Their equipment would malfunction and then they'd leave. And as soon as they did that, everything would go back to normal. There was a radio operator named Bill Stevens who was working at the Anchorage Control Tower that morning. And Bill, having worked there for 15 years, was actually the last person to ever have contact with Don's plane. And he would go on to tell investigators something that was incredibly strange, and it makes all of us wonder if there was truly something else going on. And so Bill said that during that last transmission at 10:18 a.m., everything appeared normal. Like I told you guys, Don was just giving his position update, which was very routine. But then right at the end of the transmission, Don's voice suddenly changed. And Bill said Don started speaking really slowly, like he was confused about something. And then Don started saying stuff that didn't make any sense. And he said, "The sky looks different up here." Now, Bill didn't think much of it at the time, but about 30 seconds after that transmission ended, all of Bill's equipment in the tower just went haywire, and his radar screen started showing these weird patterns he'd never seen. The radio started picking up this almost ominous low humming sound that seemed to be coming from somewhere out in the direction where Dawn's plane had been, and then everything went dead. So Bill immediately called over his supervisor, and it took them 10 minutes of just trying to get the equipment working again, and it finally became functional. And when they did get it back online, they realized Dawn's plane was just gone. It wasn't even showing up on any radar anywhere. But folks, if you don't know the story, it gets hairier. Because when they went back later and checked the radar data from right before everything went dead, there was something that nobody could really explain. The data showed that Dawn's plane hadn't descended or crashed. It hadn't turned or changed course. It had just vanished. 1 second it was there at 7,000 feet, and the next second it wasn't. And Bill wasn't the only one who experienced something odd that day, because there was actually a weather station about 50 miles from where Dawn's last transmission came from. And the two guys working there that morning, they said that right around 10:20 a.m., all their instruments suddenly spiked. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in less than a minute, which, mind you, is extreme, and their compass needles started spinning like crazy. And they both described hearing that same ominous, weird low frequency sound that made them feel physically sick. These two guys had worked at that station for years, and they'd never had anything like this happen. Later, after they checked their instruments thoroughly, there was no record of any of these readings. It was like it had never even happened. So at this point, we're roughly about a week into the search, and they brought in this local guy named Thomas George. Now, Thomas was actually a Tlingit elder who had lived in the region his whole life. And he was very familiar with the region, the mountains, the terrain, everything. So, he was probably one of the best guys to bring on the team. And after explaining to Thomas exactly where they were looking, he kind of just smirked and, shook his head at them and told them that's where the Kushtaka lives. And he went on to explain that the Kushtaka was this shape-shifting spirit his people have known about for generations, and it's very dangerous. And there is a very specific area, which was right where Dawn's last transmission had come from, that the Tlingit people had always avoided. In fact, his grandfather used to tell him that planes and boats that went into that area would sometimes vanish and never be found again. But of course, the search op wasn't going to entertain what they considered supernatural nonsense. And so they began to get really frustrated with him. But he explained that back in 1952, he had been helping search for another plane that had vanished in almost the exact spot. And during the search, they found this clearing way up in the mountains that nobody could explain, like something massive had just pushed down all the trees in a perfect circle. Of course, there was no crash debris, there's no burn marks, nothing to really explain why it was there. And so Thomas agreed to take a group of searchers up to this clearing, and when they got there, all their equipment started acting up, just like what was happening to the search planes. And of course, nothing worked, right? No compasses, radios, it was just dead. But even when they tried to take pictures of this clearing, every camera just malfunctioned. But the few photos that did come out just showed this weird black mist that nobody had seen when they were actually there. One of the searchers, a man by the name of Mike Peterson, explained how it felt like they were being watched the entire time they were in that clearing, that something was apparently just waiting for them to leave. Now, to Thomas, again, he explained that this was totally normal, and there's a reason his people had these stories and warnings of these things, because, again, many of his tribe's people had encountered and dealt with this thing for hundreds and hundreds of years. In fact, they had a name for it, and they called it the place where the sky touches the ground. And apparently, sometimes when conditions were just right, people would see things up there that shouldn't exist. Fast forward all the way almost 50 years. To 2019, and an investigator of the name of Sarah Martinez really started taking this case seriously, and she started looking into all these disappearances and what people had started calling Alaska's Bermuda Triangle. And she found some really strange things, because it wasn't just Dawn's plane that had vanished. Right? This isn't an isolated incident. And as a matter of fact, since 1988, there had been over 16,000 people who've just vanished in this exact area. And after Sarah had gotten access to all these old search and rescue records, she started to see this really bizarre pattern. In 2007 alone, the area had nearly 3,000 people go missing. which is roughly about 4 people per every 1,000 residents just vanishing, and so that's wild. Now, interestingly, there was also a report from 1992 that had never been made public. The Air Force had actually done this classified study of the area long after Dawn's plane disappeared. They had sent up these special aircraft with all kinds of sophisticated monitoring equipment, and what they found was that this whole region had these massive electromagnetic anomalies that nobody could explain. Readings showed that in certain spots, the magnetic field would suddenly spike so high it would max out their instruments. And the spikes always happen in the same places, including exactly where Dawn's last radio transmission had come from. It was also discovered that compasses in these areas would consistently point 30 degrees off from where they should, which, again, if you guys know anything about how compasses work, is pretty significant and enough to get you lost. Disturbingly, every single person who had vanished in this area had last been seen in or near one of these magnetic anomaly zones. And just like with Dawn's plane, none of these people have ever been found. And not just they're gone, it's just like there's no bodies, no belongings, there's no evidence of them. Now, in late 2022, a group of researchers were using this brand new type of radar technology that scanned the area where Dawn's plane had vanished. And even though they weren't looking for anything related to this at all, because they were actually just doing a geological survey trying to map underground formations, they found deep underground caverns or spaces in the exact spots where all these magnetic anomalies had been recorded. It's pretty freaky if you ask me. I mean, these were just massive cavities in the earth. And I'm not talking like normal caves, like normal formations. They were like intentionally dug out, like perfectly spherical. And we all know that nature doesn't just create perfectly round caves. When they analyzed the radar data closely, these spherical cavities weren't empty either. They were giving off a kind of energy signature that their equipment couldn't even classify. It was like nothing they'd ever seen. But perhaps one of the most bizarre features of these spherical cavities is that, I guess, these spherical spaces will shift positions. And in probably the craziest twist, they found recordings from an old military listening post that had been operating in the area back in '72. And on the morning Dawn's plane vanished, they had picked up a very strange sound. When they cleaned up the audio and analyzed it, they found it wasn't just a random noise, it was actually a pattern. A repeating pattern that matched the exact energy signatures they were now detecting from these spheres. Now, to this day, nobody really knows what happened to Dawn's plane or any of the other 16,000 plus people who have vanished and continue to vanish in Alaska's Bermuda Triangle. The official explanation is still that these were all just accidents, people getting lost and not finding their way back, or planes going down in bad weather. But for the people who've looked into this and have seen things that are going on, they're convinced that something very eerie is going on, something that science can't explain. And in fact, the rate of disappearances has actually increased in recent years, and it's kind of like whatever these spherical cavities are, they're becoming more active. But unfortunately, with the little information we have on all of this, it just remains one giant mystery. On the evening of June 12th, 1952, a 14-year-old boy named Tommy Whitehorse was sitting on the bank of a creek near his family's farm in eastern Oklahoma, fishing with his grandfather's old bamboo rod. Tommy loved coming out to this spot because it was so peaceful, and usually right around sunset, you could catch these huge catfish that would come up from the deeper parts of the creek to feed. Tommy had grown up on this farm with his parents, his little sister Riley, and his grandfather, who everyone just called Pop. The farm wasn't very big either. I mean, they had some chickens, a few cows, and a small garden that his mom tended. It was enough to keep them fed, and Tommy really enjoyed the work, especially when he got to help Pop fix things around the property. And so that evening, Tommy had been out at the creek for about an hour when he noticed something was off. All the crickets and frogs that usually made a lot of noise had gone quiet, and then he heard this strange sound coming from behind him, like someone was dragging something heavy in the grass. And as he turned around to look, he couldn't see anything in the growing darkness, but he was able to see this massive owl sitting in a tree maybe about 20 feet away. Of course, Tommy had seen plenty of owls, but he noted how this one was very different. It was way bigger than any he'd ever seen, and it was like almost staring through him. Additionally, its eyes didn't look right. They looked almost human. And so he sat there just staring back at this owl, and he saw that there was blood dripping from the beak onto the branch below. Now, Tommy would have kept staring at the owl, but suddenly he heard his mom calling for him back at the house, and it was time for dinner. And so he just grabbed his fishing pole and his empty bucket, and he started walking back toward the house, completely creeped out by this exchange of glances. But after only taking a few steps, he heard the sound behind him, kind of like heavy wings flapping. And when he turned around, the owl was gone. And so he didn't know what to think. He just kept walking faster. He didn't know why. Something about the owl really spooked him. And as he's getting closer to the house, he hears these strange noises in the trees above him, like he's being followed. And every time he looks up to check, he can't see anything, but he could definitely feel something watching him. And by the time he got back to the house, he was practically running. Now his mom, who was kind of watching him from a distance, couldn't really understand what the issue was. She asked him why he was running, but he just said he didn't want to be late for dinner. He didn't want his mom scolding her. And he never did tell her about the owl. Now he would mention that something deep down in him told him that he shouldn't talk about it to his parents. Well, that night at dinner, he was unusually quiet. His sister Riley kept trying to get him to play their usual game where they'd kind of make faces at each other across the table when their parents weren't looking, but he just couldn't focus on anything except for the owl and how the eyes looked so human-like. Well, after dinner, Tommy went up to his room and sat by his window looking out in the darkness, and he'd heard his grandfather and his dad talking downstairs, and they were actually discussing how a neighbor who had lived about a mile down the road had found one of his cows dead that morning. Which, by the way, livestock dying isn't weird, but there wasn't a mark on the outside of the cow. And when the neighbor cut it open to see what had killed it, its heart was missing. Now, when Tommy heard this, he didn't know why, but he somehow knew or felt that the owl he had saw was somehow responsible. And so he just sat there by the window until his mom came up and told him it was time for bed. Now, the following morning, Tommy woke up early to help Pop collect eggs from the chicken coop. And at this point, it's still dark outside. It's probably like, 5:30 in the morning. And there's just kind of like this thick fog hanging over everything. Now, as Tommy and his Pop walked across the yard to get to the chicken coop, Tommy began to notice that all the chickens were quiet. Again, weird because they're usually making all sorts of noises. And when they got to the coop, Pop handed Tommy the basket and told him to start getting the eggs while he went to go get some feed. So Tommy goes inside and started reaching under the chickens, pulling out eggs one by one. And he hears the sound coming from outside, and it's kind of like someone vomiting. And so curious, he walked over to the window of the chicken coop, and he's looking out. And even through the fog, he could see his neighbor bent over behind a tree about 50 feet away, and Tommy's looking at him, not sure what's going on, and he witnesses something that is truly horrifying. He claims that what he witnessed was his neighbor, Mr. Peter, start to change. Like his whole body just started twisting and convulsing and stretching, and then these huge wings burst out of its back. And of course, Tommy didn't know what to think about this, and so he's watching this happen, and he just drops the basket of eggs, and they of course splatter on the floor. And as that happens, Mr. Peterson kind of turns his head around and snaps and looks right at Timmy with those same human-looking eyes. Of course, Tommy fell backwards, scrambled under one of the chicken roosts, and because of all this commotion, he could hear his Pop calling out, asking what the heck is going on. But of course, Tommy's so terrified he couldn't make a sound, and he just sat there shaking, watching through the window as this thing that used to be Mr. Peters spread its wings and kind of just glided off in the fog. Now, when Pop came back, he found Tommy huddled under the roost, covered in broken eggs and yolk. And Tommy was so terrified he couldn't even speak. And now Pop is like, what has gotten into you, child? And he kept asking him what happened, and Tommy just couldn't tell him. How could he explain what he'd just seen? I mean, nobody would believe him. Well, that afternoon, Tommy's mom sent him to the general store to get some flour. I mean, Tommy didn't really want to go because he'd have to ride his bike past the house, but couldn't tell his mom why he was scared to do so. So he got on his bike and just kind of started pedaling down the dirt road. And when he got near Mr. Peters' house, he just casually saw Mr. Peters out in his yard working in his garden like nothing had ever happened. Well, that evening at dinner, Tommy's dad mentioned that another cow had been found dead. And this time it was on the Miller farm, which was about 3 miles away. Same thing as before. No marks on the outside, but apparently the heart was missing. Now, Tommy's mother said maybe it was some kind of disease, but his pop said he had never heard of any disease that can do that. And the whole time, Tommy barely touched his food. He kind of just sat there thinking about what he'd seen. And every time he closed his eyes, he could just see and relive that moment where Mr. Peters transformed. And he kept wondering if maybe he just was imagining all of this, because deep down, just none of this made sense. This wasn't real. That night, Tommy couldn't sleep. He just laid there in bed staring at his window, terrified at any moment he would see those human eyes staring back at him. And around midnight, he heard this horrible screaming noise coming from in the distance. He tried to convince himself it was just a regular owl, but it didn't sound right. Well, the next morning, as he was sitting at the breakfast table, barely able to keep his eyes open from hardly sleeping, his mom came running to the kitchen. She was crying, and she told Tommy's dad that Mrs. Wilson from the church had just called, that her 8-year-old son Billy hadn't come down for breakfast. When she went to check on him, she found him dead in his bed. Now apparently, when the doctors came to examine his body, they did find a mark on him on his chest and found out that his heart was missing, just like the cow's. It of course turned into a chaotic mess, and Tommy's mother told him to take Riley outside to play while the adults talked, and as soon as they went outside, he kind of grabbed her hand and practically dragged her into the barn, and he told her they had to stay inside, and she kept asking why, and he wouldn't tell her. He just kept looking out the barn window. At this point, they spent pretty much the whole day in the barn. He tried to keep her entertained by teaching her how to make rope out of hay, something that his pop had shown him, but the entire time, he just realized how serious of a situation this was. At dinner time, Tommy's mom kept wiping tears from her eyes because she'd been friends with Billy Wilson's mom since they were kids, and Tommy's dad and Pop were discussing how they needed to start locking on the doors and windows at night. Even though nothing bad had broken into the house, it was still a pretty nasty situation. Well, after dinner, Tommy had overheard his pop talking to his father about how strange Mr. Peters had been acting at Billy's house earlier. Apparently, he had shown up to pay his respects, but he wouldn't go inside. He just kind of stood on the porch staring at Billy's bedroom window with this strange look on his face. Well, finally, that night, Tommy decided to go into his parents' room, and he tried to tell them about what he'd seen Mr. Peters do behind the chicken coop. And as soon as he started talking about Mr. Peters, turning into an owl, his dad just cut him off because the idea was just so ridiculous and nonsensical. His dad was not going to have it. And his dad told him that this is serious. Why are you wasting our time? How dare you come into our room and do this to us as we're grieving because a little boy had died. What is wrong with you? This is not the time to make up stories to seek attention. And so, feeling very defeated about this, he just goes back to his room completely helpless. Now at some point, Tommy must have fell asleep because he would be awoken at around midnight, and somehow he had left his window open, and what had awakened him was a noise outside his window. And so he gets up and he checks outside, and he sees that there is a large shape that has landed on a very thick branch just outside his window. He almost fell backwards onto his floor because right there are those strange human eyes staring right at him through the glass. And once again, it's that same owl face he saw at the creek, and there's blood dripping from its beak again. Fresh blood, mind you. And he just starts screaming, and he's scrambling across the floor, and he's trying to get to his sister's room. And when he gets there, Riley was already sitting up in her bed crying, and she had explained to her brother that she had a nightmare about this giant bird trying to get in through her window. And so he just grabs her hand, they run downstairs to their parents' room, and at this point their mom's very confused because she's like, what's going on? But before Tommy could explain, they all hear this horrible screeching sound right outside the house, and it was so loud the windows rattled. Now at this point, Tommy's dad grabbed his shotgun, he ran outside while not saying anything, and the entire time the mom is just holding them close, protecting them. But through the window, Tommy could see his dad walking around the yard with the shotgun, just shining his light up at the trees. And everything was quiet for the next few minutes. Now his dad came back inside maybe 5 minutes later and explained he couldn't find anything, but Tommy noticed his father was very visibly spooked by something despite him saying everything's fine. Still not buying the whole owlman story, both parents decided to let Riley and Tommy sleep with them in bed the remainder of that night. Well, the following morning, Tommy's mother got another phone call, and this time it was about a different family who lived a mile away. Their teenage daughter had woken up, but she was very ill. She was pale, and she had these strange marks on her chest that couldn't be explained. Obviously, her mother was hysterical, and this caused Tommy's mom to start crying again, and Tommy heard her tell his dad that, of course, Mr. Peters had been there last week fixing their fence. And so that afternoon, Tommy was sitting on the porch watching Riley play in the yard when Mr. Peters walked up their driveway. Immediately, he goes in defense mode, and Mr. Peters has just got this playful smile, and he's carrying a basket of vegetables from his garden and explaining he brought them over because he knew how upset everyone was about everything going on. Tommy's mother, being a good host, invited him in for coffee, and they just watched as he sat there drinking coffee and talking and acting like everything was normal. But Tommy closely watched Mr. Peters and watched how he never actually swallowed any of the coffee. He just kind of pretended to drink and eat. Well, again, fast forward to that night, and Tommy heard that unmistakable sound again. It was that horrible retching sound he'd heard behind the chicken coop. And so he hadn't fallen asleep yet, but he jumped up, looked out the window, and saw that Mr. Peters was in his backyard, bent over behind a tree, and he knew what was about to happen. But this time, instead of just watching, he grabbed his grandfather's old hunting knife from under his bed and snuck downstairs. He kind of crept across their yard towards Mr. Peters' property, and he heard that wet, horrible sound getting louder. And when he got closer, he saw something awful, because they are carefully arranged on the ground what looked like human organs. Tommy's plan was to kill him. Now, even though Tommy was intent on ending Mr. Peters' life, as he got closer, Mr. Peters heard or sensed him and turned around, and Tommy just explained that his face wasn't human anymore, that it was caught halfway between man and owl, and his eyes were huge and black, and his mouth was stretched into this horrible beak-like shape as fast as he could back towards his house. And behind him, he could hear the sound of wings and the screeching noises. And the second he made it in his front door, he slams the door. Bam! Something slams right into the front door so hard it shakes the whole house. His parents come running out, or running downstairs, and of course his dad had the shotgun again, and of course he's trying to press his son, what is going on, what happened, why are you outside? But he couldn't even speak. He just kept pointing at the door where they could hear this strange scratching noise, and then everything went quiet. And I think with everything going on in the situation, Tommy's dad must have begun to believe him, because for the first time he showed his son compassion. He just held him and he started praying over him and the situation in Cherokee. And after a while, everything kind of died down, and they would sometimes hear these occasional screams outside that they weren't really sure what it was. Well, apparently later that evening, or I should say early in the morning, because it was like midnight, Mr. Peters apparently died of a heart attack. And nobody other than Tommy's family really knew what happened that night. He was basically forced to never talk about any of these events ever again, for fear that it would draw another one of these things back in their lives. However, after all of this, his mother and father started hanging owl feathers over all the windows, which was something that they'd learned from Pops's Cherokee grandmother. What's wild about this particular story is that just about every tribe has horrific stories of shapeshifters. And just like in this story, they have to kill or sacrifice a life for their power. And probably the most terrifying part about this whole story is that there are many legends and sightings of people in this area seeing what they describe as an owlman, which supposedly comes and harvests organs of its victims. However, because a lot of these stories are second-hand, third-hand, and they're kind of just passed down with only really anecdotal evidence at best, they'll probably always just remain folklore. But the reason why it's a terrifying mystery, because there have been many who've claimed to witness and encounter this thing and have nearly died from it. Unfortunately, well, not just this story, but the story of the owlman in general will remain unknown. And because you guys made it this far into the video, I want you to all comment below, sleep is overrated. So that way I know who made it to the end of the video and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, then what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. And as always, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next video.